Well, welcome everyone. It's a real pleasure to have the Peabody Leadership Council with us all day today and to be joined by our colleagues from the YIBS Advisory Board, some other folks associated with YIBS, as well as others associated with the Yale community and the museum staff. We have a real treat this evening. It's a real pleasure to introduce Paul Lussier. Paul is a 1982 graduate of Yale College who has gone on to have a kind of a dizzyingly diverse career as a television producer and writer for AOL and Time Warner. He's produced over 200 hours of television, went on to then form a private communication company called Me to You Media, which does a variety of communications consulting, but Paul has carved out a specific niche around science communication. He came to Yale in 2013 and began teaching courses both to undergraduate and graduate students, which really caught on fire and have gotten a lot of positive attention. Paul's approach to science communications, which he's going to talk to us about tonight, has won a lot of plaudits from a variety of folks. This is kind of culminating in the creation of something called the Science Communications with Impact Network, which is going to be based here at Yale. We'll have a variety of exciting projects that I'm sure Paul is going to tell us about. I won't go through them all, except to say that next month at the Conference of the Parties in Paris, at the climate talks, President Obama is going to be making a statement about one of Paul's clients and a group, the IPCC, with which a group of Yale students are interacting to help develop a strategy that President Obama will talk about at the meeting, a kind of a shift in focus for IPCC that Paul and company are helping to formulate. There's lots to hear from Paul. We're getting a little bit of a late start, so I want to make sure I give him plenty of time to talk. So let's give a warm welcome to Paul Lussier.
First of all, I want to say I'm delighted to see some of my students here, but I also am really happy I took the time to write a different lecture than the one you heard an hour and a half ago, because I was really worried about that. Hi all, and thank you. Chagrined by that introduction Dave just gave, and I hope I rise to the challenge, but there's actually more of an emphasis on grin than chagrin. Okay, so the focus of my work both at Yale and outside of Yale in the private sector is on advancing science communication and essentially generating new models by which science communications can achieve a level of impact that hopefully is unprecedented in its influence. And it's based on very specific methodologies, frameworks, and protocols that have been about 18 years in development. Some of those pilots towards this approach I will be summarizing in the course of the talk in the next 40 minutes or so. But first, where this all began for me. I began like everyone else, essentially I was working as a science reporter and producer in Time Warner, both in CNN, and then also with the Discovery Channel, where I was responsible for both producing and purchasing and supervising certainly felt like a seemingly infinite number of hours of science programming. And the approaches that we're now in the process of putting into practice around the world with private and public stakeholders are really a result of really more failures in my approach when I was sort of in charge of science programming than these successes. And so I really began like everyone else did, which is beginning with the core premise that the information, the knowledge, the science about climate change was what mattered. And at the end of the day, the premise, that core premise was essentially built on one assumption, which is that if you deny the climate science, you deny the climate science at your peril. We soon learned that that actually is not the case, and this was actually written on a wall in Mozambique, which I'll get to shortly, a wall on a project that I spent 2 years in Mozambique to develop climate change awareness. And within the first 2 days, I was met with this on a wall. I don't believe in global warming, which was kind of a direct unwelcome to me, because I was coming on behalf of the Discovery Channel, the Red Cross, and numerous foundations to develop climate change awareness to facilitate adaptation processes and products on the African coast. So my attitude was, when seeing that sign, I don't believe in global warming. I was like, okay, good luck with that, all right? At your peril. And essentially, all of our information messaging as regards science communication up to really until really last year, ladies and gentlemen, was based on one core strategy. And that was to convince the public, the global public, that there was enormous, undeniable consensus behind the science. This actually was a chart that I did in the early years, and this one actually tested better than some of the others because at least we use the word humans in it. And essentially what this 37,000 authors of peer-reviewed climate change papers, only 34 reject that it's caused by humans. Now, this actually tested very well in focus groups, and people really walked away saying, okay, I accept that the science is probably real. It was either certainly real, probably real, or not at all real. And there's about a 72% that said, okay, I sense that it's probably real. However, the gap between accepting that the science is probably real and taking action on the basis of that probable reality are two entirely different spheres of response and also attendant action to that response. As you can see here, this is a Gallup poll of 2015, and among all of the various challenges and concerns, this was in the American public. You can see for yourself where climate change rates. How important will each of the following be to your vote for Congress? Climate change is at the very bottom of that list. In response to this, the IPCC and virtually all science communications bodies have basically taken an approach to, okay, well, let's just sell the consensus. The deniers and the skeptics, they're essentially preventing the global public from knowing that the scientists are in essential agreement and there is basic accord, global accord around the science. From 2007, and this was from 2000, sorry. Yeah, okay, so that was the selling consensus. These are out of order. Selling consensus in 2007. But just to kind of take you through from 1990 essentially through to 2013, sort of the evolution of the archetypes of the messaging. 1990, Sir John Houghton, the IPCC chair at the time. The peer review has helped ensure a high degree of consensus among authors and reviewers regarding the results presented. We call that delivering consensus. Then we moved to 2001, where I started essentially interfacing with the IPCC, and we moved to what I call defending consensus. Although there is a minority of opinions which we have not been able to accommodate, the peer review has helped ensure a high degree of consensus among authors. That is in 2001. In 2013, we start demanding respect for consensus. This is the conclusion of 4,000 scientists appointed by governments, etc., and then the underlying portion present what is an overwhelming global scientific consensus as little more than an unfolding debate, and they are being nothing short, the skeptics are being nothing short of intellectually dishonest. They are a political attempt to subvert what is now a long-standing scientific consensus. What this amounted to on all of our parts, and I helped craft this message, was stomping our feet, okay? And essentially demanding attention for the scientific consensus. The gap, however, once again, this was from The Guardian in 2007, UN's vast report will end the scientific argument. Okay, got that. Now will the world act? In response to the lack of action, in response to the lack of building consensus among public and policymakers, we've basically began to develop what we thought were new strategies. Here's an example of a meme that I was a part of then, which is, and then I told them the science wasn't settled yet. This is, of course, the exact same approach, okay? And we have still not let go of our same approach, but we're simply trying to introduce irony into our approach. The irony being, these guys behind the scene really know there's consensus, and they're keeping from you the fact that there's consensus, and they're having the last laugh. Okay? The truth of the matter is, The deniers, the skeptics, the conservatives who were opposed to climate change at the time weren't concerned with whether or not there was any consensus among the science or scientists. It was not their bailiwick, not their area of focus, and not their area of strategy. What they were focusing on is values. What are the implications of this science for our values stakeholders? What are the applications of the science for our values stakeholders? What are the consequences of the application of these sciences to our values stakeholders? And how can we, on the basis of those values, begin to engage in a countervailing attempt to contradict, capitulate, and cause to capitulate the science and scientists? And they focused exclusively on how to marry their anti-science campaigns with the values to which their groups that they were accountable to and responsive to were beholden and influenced by. Meanwhile, back on the IPCC ranch, we were basically trying now to create graphs and charts which were still more colorful, still more simple, and we still hear that, ladies and gentlemen. You still say, essentially, when people talk about science communications, the first thing you're going to hear is, keep it simple, make it visual, make it graphic, bring celebrities, make it sexy. None of that matters. All right? It's like putting lipstick on a pig, as we say in the street, all right? Because all you're essentially doing is dressing up the science. And when you reduce the science to simpler, dumber, sexier, from experience, I can tell you from the news, you keep removing content. And you keep removing content. And in order to do that, you have to ultimately work from bias. What are you removing? And the second you start, what are you removing, you're actually tipping into advocacy narratives on behalf of the science much more than if you committed to, in fact, the robust transfer and transmission of knowledge. But how do you do that, okay? And this is why in our work with the students, we caution against framing. Framing is often just a form of manipulation in which you're seeking basically to encourage, still basically seeking to cause people to accept. You're still asking them, you're attempting to persuade them about the science, rather than prepare them, position them, and offer them partnership with the science based on where they want to go and what means and what their ambitions, their dreams, their achievements, their values ultimately indicate and influence where they want to go in life. When that didn't work, dressing up the graphs and charts and making them more colorful, and now, by the way, this is still really important. Dressing up the charts, keeping sentences short, this still has value, but it's not enough. And it's not, and at the end of the day, what you end up doing is reducing the science to a kind of lowest common denominator where everyone sort of more or less understands it, but they still can't find the particular inroads into the science by which they can partner with the science because it's so diluted at that point and so lowest common denominator that it doesn't mean anything to anybody. And here's an example of, again, my attempt, simply to make the science more attractive, is to sort of, you'll hear a lot about make it personal, make it sweet, make it cute, make it, create opportunities for people to identify with it. So we came up with the bright idea, okay, compare it to a bunch of kitty sneezes, okay? This was back in 2007, 2008. And as we say in class all the time, what does this really amount to, ladies and gentlemen? This amounts to desperation, okay? That's what this is. Cute, people like it in focus groups, but this is a desperate attempt to make the science acceptable. But it's still based on a core, I have a chart here, it's still based on what we call the information deficit communications model. And the information deficit communications model is exactly as it sounds. It is an attempt to communicate the science based on the core assumption that the more information you have about the science, the better educated you are about the science, the more you will be inclined to accept the science and take action. There is no cognitive connection between those two. All right? So we essentially are trapped, throwing darts against the wall that are simply being bounced back to us. And still, this is as early as 2011, most of our polling and a lot of our analysis is still focused on how to break through this, again, the perception that 81 to 100% of the scientists are in agreement, and yet only 50% of the percentage of Americans kind of accept that there's consensus. In 25 years, we have not altered our strategies at all. We're still struggling with how to communicate the consensus in all the different ways that you saw that I attempted, which really obviously didn't work. The other thing we do, obviously, and this is a real problem, is to essentially tar or brand those who refuse to accept the science or incapable of accept the science as idiots. Okay? The results of that obviously still speak for themselves. This is 2014. Again, we hear in 2014 only 15% of the public are very worried. So recently, as at about 2011, 2012, Michael Mann and other scientists stepped up and said, okay, well, this has to change. What we need to do is essentially get scientists out there speaking on behalf of the science, and we need to train them on how to communicate the science. And those scientists who are either incapable or uninterested in science communications, they don't have to be involved, but we really need to get with the program. This was a absolutely welcome and necessary and critical step in the process towards humanistic communications, which I'll get to in a moment, which is where we are now. And this was a statement made by Michael Mann, which was very controversial at the time and remains controversial still among scientists, which is, in his view, it's no longer acceptable for scientists to remain on the sidelines. But how do we do it? All right? If we know that communicating the science in and of itself isn't working, if we know that simplifying the science and dumbing it down isn't really working, what are we really training our scientists to say? How are we training them to talk? How are we training them to communicate? And are we really, at the end of the day, doing anything different? Is there a way to make this interesting to the guy with his I love you cup over his morning breakfast coffee? Is there a way, ultimately, to make that relevant, to engage that kind of reaction or excite that kind of reaction in him? And what we're competing with, ladies and gentlemen, is this. Okay? Now, in a focus group, with the graph the chart that I made that I showed you earlier, which is 34, the consensus chart, showing that over 92% of the scientists in that chart are in consensus, we put those side by side in this focus group, and we put those side by side with this, right? You can imagine what the response was. 72% of the crowd had said that they would, as a result of that chart, they accepted that the science was probably right and that there was probably consensus among the scientists. 98.7% of the folks involved all agreed that this was hugely impactful to them. Okay? And that this had much more influence than the previous slide. Right? They were put side by side. Okay? Sea levels are rising because Jesus is crying. Okay, I'll give you a reason why sea levels are rising. Sea levels are rising because Jesus is crying, because the world is going to hell in a handbasket because liberals are in charge. Right? The world is going to hell in a handbasket because scientists are telling you how to live your lives. And if we can't compete with that, we ultimately will go nowhere. Okay? And the results and the research shows consistently that this is what we're up against. This is basically a values response, right? And a values-driven communication that is set up against a science communication. And it appears at this stage that never the two will meet, but more importantly, never the two that the science-based communication can't compete. Yet it has to compete. We have no choice. The state of the planet, obviously, is at bay. 350.org, an advocacy group, very powerful, very effective. They themselves have based an entire, and I've had this conversation frequently with Bill McKibben, based an entire organization and all of their action around a number. Okay? And based around that number, there is a very limited number of people, mostly those who are already green-oriented, who understand even what that number is. A lot of good work has been under the banner of that number, but even the latest march, which was, I think, last year, where millions were reported as, and I was there, millions reported as participating, not one news outlet actually covered the subject of the march itself. What they covered was the freaks who were there, some of the grandmothers who were there, and even the Huffington Post in response to the 350.org march, their response on their headline the day after was climate what? Right? There was a lot of media about the 350, but the media was all about, okay, so how many people really showed up again? Okay? The message was completely lost, right? And one of the reasons the message was completely lost was because the message was asking for engagement, excitement, attention from the media around the concept of a global climate target, i.e. the numbers, okay? And in response to this, to show you, still, this was just after this, listen carefully to Van's approach and how he is, well, listen to his approach.
You and I have been talking about this issue for many years. I don't understand how you can have a position that you've got right now. A lot of people are saying that 97%, as I said, 97% of the peer-reviewed literature in this field says that humans are causing climate change. Let me show you who does not agree with that. Donald Trump, Professor Donald Trump, is on your side of this thing. He says it's very expensive. Global warming BS, that's the scientific term, has got to stop. You got Eric Erickson, Professor Eric Erickson, who says the difference between people who believe in the second coming of Jesus and those who believe in global warming is that Jesus, in fact, will return. Can you explain to me why you're on the side of Professor Donald Trump again?
Okay, you notice the Professor Donald Trump, okay? Once again, it's the attempt to write whatever you may think about Donald Trump's position. The fact is, Donald Trump's position is attached to a constituency that if we do not connect to and we do not attract, and if we continue to denigrate and alienate, we will not win the fight that we must fight, we must win on behalf of the science, right? So ultimately, to mock Donald Trump by referring him ironically as Professor Donald Trump is a massively counterproductive response, right? And so we have often, a result of what you have, in response to what you've just seen, there are a lot of people who essentially go to the next step of, okay, so let's blame the media. Okay, it's always what we do. And yes, media consolidation is absolutely an issue. There's no doubt about it. You can see here how basically this is the 6 companies that currently essentially control the entire media landscape. And yes, it's true that when the current editor, actually it's now, 14, when there's now a climate skeptic who's the editor in charge of environmental news at Reuters. He's considered, like I say, a skeptic. And if you'll notice the sheer number of stories that were sort of in support of climate change from 2010 to 2011, when the pre-skeptic editor was in charge, was virtually almost double what is happening now. So of course there's an impact. But there's something else. This chart, and I'll go to this one. There is an entire structure of storytelling in the media that climate science and climate change and climate change knowledge doesn't accommodate or fit. No matter how many deniers and how many skeptics and how much money there is, and to essentially take the position, well, what are we going to do? The skeptics are really well funded. We can't really fight the denialist lobby. The Republicans are really sort of in control. What are we going to do? And as I say to my students, you can assume that victim position, but do you want to ultimately solve this problem, or do you want to win in terms of your ideological position and hold on to that position and go down? All right? So if you want to take a step back and say, even if it's true the media was completely bought, and sold, and media consolidation considered climate change too dangerous, even if that was true, you have no choice but to try to invest in how media works and basically understand sort of what the exigencies of media and how climate change can fit in. Without going into all of the detail, essentially what this is the newsroom in the center. This is essentially the incoming data or your news story, and this is sort of your outgoing story on this side. And essentially, when I go into a newsroom and I say, I've got a climate change story, the first thing that the producer asks me, okay, identify the cognitive biases. Where is this scientist ultimately coming from? You say, well, he's objective. He's a scientist. He's not coming from any place. What are his values? Well, he's a scientist. He's objective. He's not coming from any particular value position. What are his concerns? Well, his concerns are on behalf of, getting his science out. Obviously, concerns on behalf of. What are his belief systems? Well, I don't know. He believes in science, all right? So we take pride in that position because that, of course, we take pride in the objectivity of science. But those responses actually disqualify it from entering the newsroom. Because in fact, inside the newsroom, the story that is going to be generated from that newsroom needs to speak to national mythos and ethos collective, needs to speak to societal norms and groups, needs to speak to personal goals of the audience and the individual, incentivize the audience, and needs to speak to audience identity definition. So you say to yourself, well, producer, you got to put this on. It's climate science. It's IPC science. He says, okay, we'll put it on. But in order to put it on, we still need to address everything in the middle. So I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll create a he said, she said debate, and we'll pit a scientist against a values stakeholder who we will trust to represent everything in the middle, which is what the newsroom and the audience cares about. We will pit a science against a values stakeholder. And what happens in that is obvious, which is that the scientist is essentially pitted. It's like throwing a scientist to the lions. I have a video that we probably won't have time to play where you see exactly that. Is Michael Mann, on behalf of the science, being subjected to value stakeholders who are accusing him of being elite, being judgmental, do you not fly a plane, look at Al Gore, does he practice what he preaches, etc., etc., etc. And no scientist can ultimately compete with that. So people say, well, it's not fair. The media is sort of setting it up. Well, the media is not setting it up. The method of storytelling that the media requires is essentially causing that position to happen. So it was a result of that and my work at the Discovery Channel where I was trapped between this. I was trapped between essentially, okay, so what do you do in this situation? You do what we're all doing now. You vacillate between doomsday scenarios to get people excited, or positive scenarios. It's a renewable future, it's a happy future for all, and nobody believes either of them. Right? And I was trapped in that. And the way that gets translated at the Discovery Channel is you don't produce the audience revenues, okay? And this is an example of some things that I was involved in which will represent that vacillation, ladies and gentlemen, between doomsaying and essentially paradise selling, paradise touting. So we say, okay, so we've got this. We've got information deficit model, which is essentially the IPCC model, and over here we have what's called information surfeit, which is the entertainment model, right? Drama first, data first. Encourage thinking and action based on rhetorical information and emotional response, or give enough information and hope that change will come. I left the Discovery Channel because I failed in essentially delivering the kind of response. Spent $22 million on a miniseries, Final Hour, which became 11th Hour, the Leo DiCaprio movie. That didn't do well either. And I said, something is really wrong. So I left the Discovery Channel and traveled around the world and settled in numerous places, and we basically signed up with the Red Cross and others to basically deliver sort of climate change awareness to the least developed countries, to help sort of move the least developed countries to some sense of awareness, education, uptake, and hopefully adaptation to climate. So the situation in Mozambique when I arrived was we were in the middle of a series of floods related to typhoons. This is Mozambique in 2000. At the early rains, the soils become saturated, and at the time, Mozambique was losing, over the course of a 10-year period, 375,000 lives. Right? So I went there, and I said, okay, I'm going to step into this community, and I, along with all of these other partners from the West, are going to teach people about climate change to help them out. Okay? Back to that. Okay? It didn't take me but a week to realize that nobody was interested in hearing what I had to say, and the response was uniform. You did it, you fix it, when you have it fixed, you tell us how you fixed it. Because at the end of the day, what we care about is our survival. So don't come here telling me about how our schools basically should become more attentive and essentially teach climate change to our students. We don't care, go away. I said, okay, that was really the turning point for me. And at the time, I had pilots in Brazil, Chile, Argentina, Indonesia, and in Mozambique. And I said, all right, let's reverse this. Let's stop asking people to accept climate change, and let's instead, as the class host, you guys can finish this for me, let's ask what addressing climate change can do for people. What can climate change and addressing climate change do for you? Not what you can do for climate change. let's rethink this. So what we did is we developed a segmented approach, and we said the only group that really needs to know about climate science here are the weather people. And why? Because what we're going to focus on is not climate change. We're going to focus on the floods related to the typhoons, right? And the floods related to the typhoons that are claiming lives. And we're going to go to the ministry and we're going to say, do you want to reduce the number of lives lost? Over the course of the next 5 years, you have forecast these floods are only going to continue. Well, of course we do. Okay, then let's initiate a campaign on how we might do that. And how you might do that, ladies and gentlemen, requires and invites that you become more attuned and attentive and interested and invested in climate knowledge, right? Number one, we went to the weather people. This is me, and we're essentially training in the television meteorologists. We're training them not on climate change. We're training them on the application of the science as it relates to the typhoons which were causing floods, and essentially partnering with scientists to communicate the simple message that these floods are not anomalous, because these typhoons are not anomalous, and they're only likely going to grow in time and intensity over time. Again, do you want to save lives? Well, great. I'm a meteorologist, and I want to basically be sharing with my audience an opportunity to save lives. So I'm going to essentially be on TV, and I'm going to be connecting my audience with climate change and the connection to the typhoons and the floods. The first was prepare. The second was position. Let's go to urban planners. Did this with the Red Cross. And let's say, okay, you want to save lives? Let's prepare your urban city planners with road signage, and we're going to road signage which will prohibit people from going down roads that they now go down when they're trying to flee the storm, but the road ultimately floods and they drown. How do we prevent that from happening? Well, number one, we had to convince the urban planners that there was investment needed to be made in infrastructure, and investment needed to be made in rerouting in order to save lives. Basic climate knowledge attendant to that goal was applied, and we developed, working with graphic artists, we developed this sign, which is now, if you go to Mozambique, you'll see these signs everywhere. Don't go down this road, it's very simple. Your car will be underwater. Secondly, provide. When the typhoons and floods hit, how are we going to save lives? Well, urban architects said we don't have any money, we don't have any infrastructure. What are we going to do? We involved multiple stakeholders in this conversation. We addressed specifically the application of the climate science to the multiple stakeholders, and the tribal leaders stepped up and they said, we've got 30,000 trees. Let's build tree houses. Let's make it possible, give people a place ultimately to go and climb and find refuge. Now that doesn't look like much, but that tree saved lives. That tree was actually the basis of what became a global story that you may all have heard. Well, this is all fuzzy, sorry about this, which is producing results, which is a mother being rescued as she is delivering a child, which is this child, okay? And this child was saved, life was saved. This child has gone on to become this boy here, who runs one of the most successful NGOs in MGO on behalf of climate science, right? The story that we could tell was as a result of this multi-stakeholder approach in information transmission, there was a degree of viability and a degree of activity that allowed lives to be saved and made this story possible. The result now is Mozambique, now 15 years, 12 years later, has one of the highest climate IQs in the world. Right? Climate science is taught in schools. It is in all of their textbooks. It is not controversial, and it is a regular part of all weather and news forecasts. Right? This is touted by the World Bank as one of the most successful institutes for climate disaster management coordinated function. This is sort of the architecture that Mozambique has also put together in response to upcoming and ongoing climate impacts and effects. In order to communicate what we communicated, we needed to the various stakeholders, we needed to involve each of these social science dimensions. And we need to involve experts in each of these areas in order to partner with the various stakeholders to communicate the relevance of climate science. So I returned from that experience back to the Time Warner Discovery Channel to this climate, okay? And it was still essentially a version of the same. And about the time, Schellenberger and Nordhaus from the Environmentalism is Dead group had done a survey essentially associating the key words that they could, that were most touted and most referenced in the environmental movement by environmentalists. And you can see here, all of them are about restriction, regulation, renaming, constraining, preventing, halt, and preserve. It's impossible to gain forward momentum when what you're emphasizing is restriction, reversal, constrain, prevent, halt, preserve. And for those who think, well, at the end of the day, let's focus on weather. People really get extreme weather. Well, this was a study, a 5-year research study done by George Marshall. This is a man who lost his home in Sandy. This is my home. I guess we're just hoping another Hurricane Sandy doesn't come along anytime soon. Under the circumstances, it's understandable that a community recently struck by climate disaster finds a climate change narrative of responsibility, austerity, and future hardship unwelcome. So you'd think that people after a disaster would maybe be better off to, would be better equipped to accept climate, but no. As long as the message is still about reverse, constrain, prevent, halt, it actually only discourages people in the face of hardship even more. Lastly, why does activism do not want to talk about climate change? Again, in response to Hurricane Sandy, I would have been better off if I'd burned the building down, but I'm no fan of Al Gore. Business is a gamble, and this is how free enterprise works. Okay? So what we have done is essentially base an entire movement, an entire communications architecture on the protection, regulation, protection, regulation of nature for its own sake, asking people really to step up, all right, to a climate target, step up to a climate goal on behalf of the globe. What we haven't done is begun to really personalize and connect the natural domain with climate results. Skip through because sometimes what we haven't done is connect this to this, right? We still are essentially relying on a message about sort of protecting sort of the planet. All of our scientific frames are still about global averages. Whether it's a 390 target, a 4 target, a 500 ppm target, or whether it's a 2-degree target, 3-degree target, less than 2-degree target, at the end of the day, this here is this is the story we're still telling, but the story about a boy who's rescuing his dog, who is escaping from a typhoon which can be connected to climate change, a boy who is willing to talk about what he went through, his anxiety, his duress, and demanding that there be better understanding and education so that this not continue. This is not a story any of us covered. Not in one environmental press covered this story. This story is constantly being covered. So what we've done, my last 5 minutes here, is begun to develop a communications architecture that we call marrying scientific correctness with values congruence, beginning to establish ways in which the science, in its full integrity, can begin to be transposed to speak to different values groups and to address their concerns. Again, you care about social justice, you care about economic opportunity, you care about stability, you care about public health, you care about disease, you care about the future of your children. Climate change can help. And climate change can help advance what you care about. Flipping it. And in all of our communications, marrying your passion with the scientific facts, with symbols that ultimately mean something to you and your community. Those can be tribal symbols, those can be iconic symbols, those can be memes such as liberty, equality, freedom of information, etc. But the sweet spot is that intersection in the middle, creating a way where science can commune with and intersect with belief. The climate change cognitive challenges that are common, that we all know about, are what we seek to address in these approaches. Here is essentially a review of what really has been identified by now 10 years of cognitive research, which pointing to why it's so hard for people to accept and act on the climate science. Perceptual limits and self-interest, it's too far away. Lack of gratification, what's in it for me in order to act on it. The prisoner's dilemma, what's in the best interest of the globe may not be in the best interest of my nation. What's in the best interest of my neighborhood may not be in my best interest. Invisibility of causes, touch it, feel it, I guess it's happening, but I can't put my finger on it. Complexity and uncertainty, can't be certain about the science, can we? All of that adds up to a massive communications challenge. So what we're doing now, working with the IPCC, is beginning to break down, and I've been working on this for now close to a decade now, holding workshops around the world between different sectors where we've identified the different narrative engines and the different languages that each of these sectors speak. And what we practice is the transposition of the science to each of these sectors. And at the top of the vertical axis here, accuracy, this is the top my top right, this is the top value that defines scientific language. It's the premium value, and that is accuracy. But the premium value in media is drama, the premium value in policy is realism, and the premium value in business is actionability. How essentially do you then transpose accuracy into each of these different realms? And that is what we're in the process of doing. We've developed a variety of methodologies by which this transposition can take place. Generally speaking, you need 3 of these qualities in this column to match any 3 in another column in order for an effective communication to take place. This is the basis of the new work with the IPCC, which will be essentially evolving working groups, special reports, and summary reports, which will enable science congruence with each of these sectors, starting with business. All right? And what we're in the process right now is setting up both a digital network and a science business network to essentially practice the transposition from science to business. So far, we've been working effectively in this regard with Nestle, Virgin, UBS, Tata, Chase, General Electric, and several others. Also, we've been working with the Saudi Arabian ministry and Chinese ministry on similar transpositions of science into action. So what we find is that somewhere between information deficit, which is about data first, and somewhere in between, and somewhere in the drama first, there's a new approach, and it's called humanistic communications. And that approach is essentially a sectoral approach, which is one specific scientific study, ladies and gentlemen, can have 7 different dimensions and 7 different narratives that can speak to 7 different groups in 7 different ways, but it's the same single set and piece of data. All right? How the science, again, to go back to the core thesis, do you have a problem? Do you have a concern? Do you have an objective? Do you have an aim? And how can climate science knowledge help you in solving this problem? Not how you can help climate science, but how can climate science help? It's not how you say it, but what you're saying. And what we further, to drill down a bit more, what we further do is begin to match these sectoral groups with different social science-based hierarchical groups. Where do these folks within these sectors sit? Physiological safety, social esteem, self-fulfillment. And what you learn is that at the top, and I'll show you another slide as I only have 2 more slides, at the top here, the self-actualization, that tends to be fulfilled, educated, affluent, preponderantly Western, but not entirely Western groups who can really afford to take in the science, who understand kind of what the science means, are willing to accept the science, but that doesn't mean they act on the science any more than someone down here. Because as Dan Kahan's work here at Yale has made very clear, is that the more educated you are, the more capable you are of actually confirming your own bias and justifying your action or inaction. But what we're doing in the SWIN program is we're beginning to marry narratives that work with these different levels of where people are in the levels of well-being. So if ultimately, again, if climate science here or science communications in general is the category, at the bottom here we have the physiological level, and what tends to move people down here, like in Mozambique, are narratives of health, food, and water. Secondly, safety. resilience, homeland security. Sorry, this was in keynote, so it got a little bit social. If you're at the social, safety, those who are concerned about their safety. Social, those who are concerned about kind of where they sit in sort of the tribe, where they sit in their community, what is their social standing. Those people are ultimately moved by religion, which of course is tribal in nature, and ethics. People who already have a sense of self-esteem, well, they're actually the ones who are most impacted by media messaging. Leo DiCaprio, studying it with celebrities, etc., that's that group. And they're actually impacted by the economics of, the good sense and economics of climate science. And lastly, where we focused all of our attention, convincing people of the science in opposition to the anti-science crowd, that's at the very top of the pyramid. And there's only a very small group that is actually listening to that narrative, right? So in essentially not diversifying our messaging, not investing in the values that are attendant to each of these groups at the lower part of the pyramid, we focused all of our attention at the top. A classic example of who sits at the top would be President Obama, the upper half of Maslow's hierarchy and a hierarchist. Okay, so I'm going to close with a story. Rather than focus on the connection, for example, between climate knowledge, climate science, and let's say rising levels of sea level in Boston, how do we bring it to the here and now? How do we tell a different story that will bring people to that story? And we say, okay, well, we'll take that story about sea level and we'll put some people in it. And we'll take some graphics about what Boston's going to look like in 2050 as the sea level rises and it eclipses the harbor, et cetera, et cetera. And then you have a story like this. You have a story about how climate change is already impacting our world. But it's not about sea level, okay? It's about this. So about 6 months ago, there was two young men who tried to block a frigate, an oil frigate, from coming into Boston Harbor. They were part of Greenpeace and 350 groups. They were arrested. And it was the story of their arrest was very big in the news. The DA, whose job it was to prosecute, struggled for 6 months. He put them in jail, et cetera, but he struggled so much with what it really meant to prosecute these young guys. He went to his boss, he went to the mayor, he went to his fellow attorneys, he went to his family, and he understood, and he talks about still, how climate change and the challenge of climate change was causing him to completely reassess and redefine what his vocational responsibility was. Do I prosecute them? Well, that's my job. That's what I was elected to do. Do I free them? This is really confusing to me. Climate change was changing the very definition by which he practiced law. At the end of the day, what the man did do was free them and drop all charges. And as a result, he lost his job. All right? This is a climate story. This is a science story. This is a story about how climate science is forcing us and inviting us to make different choices, different applications, to chart different paths, and an opportunity to mirror kind of what climate change is doing to us, as all of our policy programs, our policy protocols, our laws, the way we conduct business, the way we measure biological wealth, all of that is up for grabs, and all of us are struggling with that. And so I invite us all to marry scientific knowledge with the stories on the ground about what it really takes ultimately to begin to implement the knowledge into our lives. And that's what the Humanistic Communications program is all about.